Good evening, everyone. That was actually pretty good, but just to make sure we all hear, good evening, everyone. Oh, that sounds beautiful. It is so wonderful to be with you all this evening. My name is Dr. Corey Charles Gooding, and I am an associate professor of political science and international relations, as as well as the current director for the program in Africana Studies. Yeah. It is truly my honor to welcome you all to a public conversation about race, democracy, and the Darkened Light of Faith with Dr. Melvin Rogers and Dr. Timothy McCarty. This event is made possible in part by the Humanities Center, which is dedicated to the exploration of the human condition and the limitless ways in which human beings understand and interact with our world. From the Humanities Center, I want to express my deep gratitude to the Assistant Director, Lindy Villa, as well as Director Brian Clack, who's here in the room, and as well as Program Coordinator Maggie McCrae. Thank you so much for your support in this program. I would also like to express my gratitude to the Department of Political Science and International Relations, and particularly the work that Executive Assistant Emily Farrell, as well as our wonderful chair, Dr. Casey Dominguez, have done in making sure this evening is possible. I also think it's important to recognize my co-conspirators in bringing this evening together. Assistant Professor of Philosophy, Dr. Jennifer Tillman, as well as Associate Professor of Political Science, Dr. Timothy McCarty. More on him in a second. Yeah. So this evening, we have the good fortune to engage with these two great scholars to discuss an important book that is extraordinarily relevant for our times. We will begin with a discussion between them, and then we will open it up to the broader audience for a robust discussion. We also invite you thereafter to join us out on the west patio for a little reception, but more on that later. So let me tell you a little bit about these two wonderful scholars that we'll have an opportunity to hear from this evening. First, Dr. Timothy Wyman McCarty. He's Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the University of San Diego. He teaches political theory, and his research focuses on democratic theory, theories of complicity and moral responsibility, right-wing radicalism, and politics and literature. He is also the co-author of a newly published article that just came out this week in the journal Politics, Groups, and Identities, titled Reactionary Heel Politics, The New Rhetoric and Politics of Racial Provocation, where he and his co-author account for the peculiar character of contemporary right-wing racial discourse and offer a systematized description of a rhetorical strategy that they call reactionary heel politics. He keeps looking this way because I'm that co-author. I'd also like to introduce you all to Dr. Melvin Rogers. He is the Edna and Richard Salmon Distinguished Professor of Political Science and Associate Director of the Center for Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at Brown University. He is also the Spring 2025 Knapp Chair for the Liberal Arts here at USD. Professor Rogers has a wide range of interests in contemporary democratic theory and the history of American and African American political thought. He has edited John Dewey, The Public and Its Problems, and African American Political Thought, a collected history that shows the work of 30 essays on figures in the tradition of African American political thought, co-edited with Jack Turner. He now serves as the co-editor of Oxford University Press, New Histories of Philosophy, which attends to the unstudied resources in the history of philosophy with a particular interest in Africana philosophy. I should also mention, and this is particularly relevant for the work this evening, he is the author of the extraordinary work, The Darkened Light of Faith, Race, Democracy, and Freedom in African American Political Thought. It is an ambitious account of the profound ways African Americans have reimagined democracy. The Darkened Light of Faith offers invaluable lessons about how to grapple with racial injustice and make democracy work. It is the winner of the Ralph J. Bunch Award for the American Political Science Association, winner of the David Easton Award, Foundations of Political Theory section of the American Political Science Association, and winner of the Best Book Award in American Political Thought section for the American Political Science Association. The brother's got a lot of awards. It is my honor to introduce Dr. Melvin Rogers and Dr. Timothy McCarty.
Well, thank you, my esteemed co-author, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you all for coming. I'm very humbled by the opportunity here to sit on the stage with a scholar whose work I have admired for many years. And I hope that the questions that I elicit and the conversation that we can bring forth will do some degree of justice to his extraordinary work, especially in this book, The Darkened Light of Faith, which I could not possibly say enough great things about. So to get us started, I'd love to start by giving a sort of brief overview of my understanding of what this book is all about, and then I'll give you the chance to tell me whether I'm wrong about it. So here's how I have understood, because most of the folks in this room have not had a chance to read it. I want to give you a sense as a reader of how I experienced this book. In an interview last year, you described the genesis of The Darkened Light of Faith as emerging from reflections on the place of uncertainty in moral and political thought, which led you to think deeply about a group of African-American political thinkers and activists that thought about uncertainty, and not only thought about uncertainty, but lived in a society that claimed to be democratic while being unquestionably oppressive. The animating question of the book is, what is it about democracy for them that justified their faith in it? How did they understand democracy? And the book features an extraordinarily wide cast of characters, most prominently David Walker, Frederick Douglass, Anna Julia Cooper, Ida B. Wells, Billie Holiday, W.B. Du Bois, and James Baldwin. And what links the engagement with these figures is a question that permeates the book. How did they seek to maintain faith in democracy amidst conditions of not only profound uncertainty, but also oppression, violence, and despair? Each of these thinkers confronted circumstances that could lead even the most hopeful among us to succumb to despair. And yet what you find in each of them is an approach to democracy that emphasizes what you describe as, quote, a naturalistic faith in humans' collective capacities to be better than what they are, and faith in the power of a political vision to capture the imagination of others and direct their actions. That's from page 22, if any of you are keeping tabs at home. And to be clear, what is, I think, truly extraordinary in your picture in the book is that the faith that you depict is not a cockeyed optimism or an uncritical, naive expectation in the inevitability of progress. For each of the figures under consideration, it's a hard-earned, historically grounded, and philosophically robust conception of human nature and democratic politics that positions the universal human capacity for judgment and the malleability of social and political institutions as a basis for continued struggle to bring about a more just democratic society. And the book is framed by subtly contrasting this image of democratic faith with two opposing approaches to making sense of the persistence of white supremacy and systemic racism in America. On the one side, you have what you describe as the racial liberalism of folks like Gunnar Myrdal. And these are the folks who treat white supremacy as a peculiar exception to the dominance of the American creed of liberty and equality for all. And that results in a kind of religious belief that democracy in America is fated to win the battle against white supremacy. On the other side, You have the Afro-pessimism of folks like Frank Wilderson and Jared Sexton, who treat white supremacy as a permanent and inescapable feature of American democracy. And against both of these deterministic tendencies, which treat history as destiny, either a fixed destiny of racial progress or a fixed destiny of white supremacy, you offer up democratic faith as a way to maintain focus on the kind of human agency that is necessary to both justify and motivate radical political action. As should hopefully be obvious, you've persuaded me. And more than that, you've persuaded me twice. You persuaded me first as a political theorist and a historian of political thought. I am, as a reader of this book, entirely compelled by your account of the history of ideas and your interpretation of the thinkers under examination. Secondly, and maybe even more importantly, you've persuaded me as a democratic citizen committed to a vision of multiracial democracy. In that capacity, I'm persuaded by your vision of what is necessary to justify and motivate the kind of radical political action necessary to bring about the world we imagine might be possible. But we have a whole room full of people looking to be persuaded. So instead of me just describing all of the wonderful ideas I've gained from your book, I'd love for you to start by telling us a little bit about what it is that led you to embark on this project. What is it that you read, that you experienced, that you saw in the world that got you going on this path to write this wonderful book?
Can you all hear me? So before I respond, I just want to say how grateful I am to be here and be with all of you. I appreciate, as I've been saying throughout the week, I appreciate Corey and Tim and others working to bring me here, because you can bring other folks. And it means a great deal when your colleagues at other institutions deem your work worthy in such a way that they say, come on in and spend some time with my folks, right? My colleagues, my students, and that means a great deal. And I also want to say thank you, because these kinds of things don't happen without a great deal of folks involved. Some we know of, and then there's always the invisible labor that make the space, the microphones, right, that make everything possible. So I want to say thank you to those folks as well. So Tim, thank you for that, I think, rich retelling of what the book is about. What led me to write the book, which is nowhere to be found in the book, and has nothing to do with any academic, it has nothing to do with anything outside of myself. It is the sort of selfish desire, which was I wanted to write a book about these figures that I wanted to read. That it had seemed to me, as a political theorist, as a political philosopher, that the constellation of African American thinkers, even as they found themselves struggling against practices of domination and exclusion, that in the process of struggling against those terrible and deadly forces, that African American thinkers were offering up their own vision of not only what a democratic society should look like, but the kinds of habits and sensibilities that are required of us to sustain such a vision. And it had seemed to me, as I was thinking about these figures, that they really rose to the level of the grandness of a kind of philosophical epic. And so minimally, I wanted to aspire to tell a kind of grand story that I had hoped would, in the eyes of these figures, be deemed worthy. But that was because that's what I wanted to read. It had nothing to do with other folks. That's what I wanted to read. But of course, then we have to sort of say to ourselves as academics, whether as professors, as students, okay, has no one else said this kind of thing? Right? Where does this fit in the drift of conversation around these figures? And what had seemed so striking to me at the time, and still now, is that there were so many in political theory, in philosophy, in political science more broadly, there were so many theories of justice and circulation, so many philosophical meditations on domination about the United States, where the United States was treated as the case study, but there was nowhere to be found in those books, these voices. And it seemed to me that if one wanted to talk about theories of justice and the ways in which justice has been denied, it had seemed to me that if one wanted to talk about practices of domination and ways in which people try to understand it in their quest for freedom, African Americans served as good candidates that one could turn to, that there was an archive of thinking there that one could mine and to try to illuminate their response to practices of domination. So armed with both the selfish desire and the external attempt to intervene in conversations and debates around how do we understand democracy and what are the prerequisites of character to sustain it, I set about the business of working through these thinkers and trying to write the book that I published in 2023.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Writing the book you want to read. What a beautiful idea that a lot of us academics could learn from. Now, speaking of these thinkers that you wanted to lift up, I want to turn to one of them. So the first 3 chapters of your book focus on the political and philosophical vision of David Walker. Now, David Walker, of course, was a writer and activist who died tragically young at the dawn of the second wave abolitionist movement, and whose entire published output is comprised of a single pamphlet that is barely larger than a single chapter of your book. And I would love for you to say a few words about why going back to David Walker and engaging with him in such a sustained way is so important for your project. Why is Walker such an important voice to lift up, both for those of us who care about the history of political philosophy and for those of us concerned about faith and democratic citizenship today?
That's a great question, and I remember when I was presenting, as we often do, we're working on a book project, we begin to go around and present sections of it to just try to get a sense of what folks are thinking about, how the pieces of the project are landing with folks, and the kinds of revisions that one ought to make. And there was a lot of pushback around David Walker. Why David Walker? Why David Walker? And in my mind, it had seemed so clear. 1829, David Walker is living now in Boston, and he attempts to strike a blow at the institution of slavery. And he writes this pamphlet, 1829, The Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, but in particular and very expressly to those of the United States. And he not only writes this pamphlet, but he gets it in the hands of some seamen, and it began to move south into southern states. And so incendiary was the pamphlet from the perspective of southern governors and mayors that many southern state legislatures began to pass bills, anti-literacy bills, in large part stimulated by Walker's appeal. But Walker's appeal was important in another sense, that prior to his pamphlet, you had African American thinkers, extraordinary African American thinkers, engaged in practices of contestation, both formally in a kind of protest way and also in written form, in textual form. But most of those texts, 90% of those texts before David Walker, had a kind of soft touch to them. It is with David Walker that you get an intense, argumentative, and resentful response grounded in a kind of righteous indignation. And if you read the pamphlet, typographically, it is a pamphlet that was meant to be read aloud, and he tells you that. But there are exclamation points and exclamation marks all over the place. Sometimes 2, sometimes 4, sometimes 5 at the end of a sentence. To convey rhetorically that when you read this line, it requires an intensity of passion in order to properly deliver it. And Walker had no problem subjecting his white counterparts to a moral and political undressing. For those of you who are familiar with the 4th of July address from Frederick Douglass, and you think, boy, that's intense, that address is not possible without the pamphlet. And so it had seemed to me, for those 2 reasons, that this was the place that one needed to start. And then the third reason is that Walker says at the very beginning of his pamphlet that this is a pamphlet that must be read by every man, woman, and child. That is to say, he thought the work of responding to racial inequality and the work of transforming the United States was the work that needed to be burdened by every man, woman, and child. It is a text that contains both arguments about integration and courts nationalism. It is a text that centers religious indignation, but has no problem flirting with secular critiques of the American polity. All of the roads that would become, the very different roads that would become African American political thought, practice, and resistance, they all lead back to David Walker. And so it seemed to me that that was the place to begin.
You mentioned how rhetorically powerful the appeal is, and one of the things that I really love about your book is your expansive picture of democratic persuasion, and in particular, your book offers democratic readings of 2 different discursive modes that are often perceived as elitist and manipulative, and one is the prophetic tradition, and the other is rhetoric. With the prophetic tradition, you focus on David Walker. With rhetoric, you focus on W.B. Du Bois. And can you say something about why it felt important to craft this kind of democratic rehabilitation of these modes of communication, and what it means for democracy if we are open to prophetic and rhetorical modes of persuasion, especially in the case of racial injustice?
Right. So let me begin with the prophetic. That when we think about the prophetic religious voice, we are thinking about a voice that takes itself to be authorized by God because it is in communion with. And that the prophetic voice is engaged in offering up prophecies about how we ought to organize our lives and in light of our failure to adhere to what Jesus commands. Just to keep it simple here for a moment, right? We can complicate that in various ways, but just for us, right? When you think about the prophetic voice, though, in that way, nothing about it seems democratic. It is authorized by a power that exceeds this world It doesn't seem to be open to accountability and to responsibility among other human beings. And yet, what's so striking about Walker's sort of participation in prophecy is that Walker is quite clear that ultimately the power of biblical prophecy depends on one's interlocutors, one conversation partners, taking it up as the foundation of their existence. And thus it means that it does matter that you assent to what the prophet is saying. And to say that it matters that you assent to what the prophet is saying, it also means that in that assent, there is an authorization that is coming from the people to the prophet. Yes, what you say rings true, and thus I am going to act in the light of it. Walker was very clear from his perspective that he had done his work in writing the pamphlet. He had done his work vis-a-vis God, but he was also very clear that for this to be instantiated in the world, African Americans and his white counterparts listening in had to say yes to it. In the case of rhetoric, which is at work both in the prophetic form, but it becomes quite central as we move downstream. If we think about W.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk, 1903, Du Bois himself was trained in a rhetorical tradition, and he took rhetoric very seriously. But sometimes we often, and we do it in contemporary politics, right? Think about these kinds of formulations. Well, that's just the rhetoric of the Democratic Party. That's just the rhetoric of the Republican Party. That's just your that's just your talking points, right? All of what this is meant to convey is that the rhetorician is engaged in trying to manipulate you to engage in a set of actions or to hold a set of beliefs that will redound to the benefit of the rhetorician. Both David Walker and Du Bois thought that that could happen, but there's a distinction to be made between rhetoric and manipulation. That rhetoric is about painting a picture in words for your fellows and attempting to move them from their side to your own. But that the way this happens is that the rhetorician paints that picture in words, and you take it in, you chew it over, you digest it, and you must ultimately say, yes, I am persuaded in the light of what you have shared. But at the moment in which you say that you're persuaded, it won't be because of something that the rhetorician has done to you, but something you will have done for yourself. You have taken it in, you've chewed on it, and you have used your judgment. That the judgment you arrive at, if you say yes, that it overlaps with the judgment of the rhetorician, well, the rhetorician was trying to move you to their side. But rhetoric is not about coercion. It is about persuasion. And the reason why both David Walker and especially Du Bois leaned in on rhetoric is because it mattered to them that at the end, when you said that you were persuaded and that you now, because of that, will live your life in the light of these values, it was very important to get one's counterparts there. Because it meant that when laws were silent, when institutions weren't active, you would continue to comport yourself in a certain kind of way vis-a-vis your fellow Black counterparts, vis-a-vis your fellow citizens, right?
Thank you. So in answering that, you gestured toward what is one of the central concepts of the book from the title on down, which is the notion of faith. And so I suppose to get somewhat big picture about your argument, I know this is a word that has complex imbrications for everyone in this room, some of them more and less religious. And so I would love for you to say a few words about how you define faith as it functions in your book, and to say something about how you see democratic faith, whether or not it necessarily involves a religious or metaphysical element, or if it's something more naturalistic, available to believers and non-believers alike.
So one of the things to keep in mind about the book is that in terms of its intellectual contributions, in terms of if folks were classifying this book, what would they say that it is? It is a book that participates in the history of political thought. So I am trying to follow these thinkers in light of a question that animates them. And I do the same thing with respect to the concepts of faith and hope that are in circulation in the book. And it's important to follow the thinkers on this because those concepts, as Tim just said, those concepts are deeply and profoundly contested, and there are different definitions depending on whether or not one is moving in philosophical circles or theological circles or political theoretical circles. So it seemed to me, well, let me just follow the thinkers and what they have to say about this, and to see if what they have to say about this is stabilized across their thinking. And the account of faith that emerged is really taken from a debate between the Black nationalists, arguably the Black nationalist Martin Delany of the 19th century, and Frederick Douglass. Martin Delany writes a letter to William Lord Garrison, right, the famous abolitionist. And in this letter that he writes to William Lord Garrison, he says, Martin Delany says, look, I would willingly stay and fight the good fight if there was any hope, any probability that the Black man would enjoy the same rights as his white counterpart. Douglass gets wind of the letter, it's published, and Douglass responds. Delany was a defender of immigration. Black people need to pick up and go elsewhere. So Delany responds. He says, look, I don't disagree, and this is what Douglass says. I don't disagree with Brother Delany because he's interested in immigration enterprises. I disagree with Brother Delany because he doesn't have sufficient faith that the Black man can get a fair hearing on American soil. And so, of course, that raises the question, well, we have now, you read, thinking of Douglass, you read Delany, he used hope. Now you're using faith. Is there a difference that makes the difference in the use of these two terms? And when you read them closely, it turns out, yes, there is a difference. Notice that in Martin Delany's letter to William Lord Garrison, he says, if there were any hope, any probability. Essentially for Delany, the markers of hope are found in empirical indicators that you can sort of turn to your community and see, yeah, this is worthy of fighting a good fight. I think we might have a chance. It's not certainty of success, but these markers are good indicators that this society is trying to transform. In the case of Douglass, he does not tie it to any empirical markers. Faith for Douglass and the subsequent thinkers turn out to be the commitment to a belief that actually runs ahead of the evidence that you need to justify the belief. So that faith for them is, in fact, this running ahead with the hopes that the figuration of this new and imagined world that you are painting for your fellows, that it will be sufficiently compelling, that it will move your fellows in time. This description of faith is not just simply a projection of the imagination. It is also the kind of belief that orients you and directs you in time. That is to say, it disciplines your habits and sensibilities, and it fortifies your soul in the face of the long battle. Notice that in this kind of description, it could have a religious character to it, but it need not. And one of the things that I tried to do in the book, and to try to be very sensitive to, is that across the range of these thinkers, some of them are more religiously inclined than others, even as they seem to land on the same kind of position. And so one needs to sort of manage the fact that all of them seem to be engaged in this faith-based talk, but all of it is not religiously inflected. And so that's how I come to this account of faith that animates the book.
That's wonderful, and you actually answered two of my follow-up questions in that answer. So that's great. That just validates that I was, we clearly are thinking along the same lines. And so one of the in thinking about having faith in your fellow democratic citizens, you lift up an idea that I think is really interesting, and I suspect might be of interest to the political scientists in this room, which is a distinction between what you call the descriptive people and the aspirational people. And you connect this distinction to the vision of democratic faith. And I'd love for you to say something about what you mean by this distinction and how orienting our politics around a vision of the descriptive people is different than when we orient our politics around pursuit of an aspirational people.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the things, in our contemporary politics, we can't escape people talk. Every politician wants to lay claim to what the American people believe or feel, what they're committed to and the like. There is no politician on the national stage that doesn't speak in this way. But one of the things that I think is important about this language that has animated our political discourse is that whether we're talking about African Americans, whether we're talking about women fighting for equality, whether we're talking about poor white farmers in the 19th century pushing back against the federal government, the invocation of the people has always worked in two ways. That in the first instance, it's just simply a description of those who enjoy the rights and privileges per the Constitution. That's just a descriptive account of the people. That when I refer to the people in this descriptive sense, I'm referring to those who enjoy the privileges of this country. But those who have sort of have been under the foot of oppression and domination and have tried to resist, they often will deploy this language of the people as well, but they typically will mean it in an aspirational register, a people not yet, a people that may yet be. And what this distinction amounts to is not just simply those who have been oppressed deploying a different account, but in fact, when you sort of press on it and lean on it, what you come to realize is that the aspirational description of the people has always been used to legitimize the very process and dynamism of democratic life. Or let's put it in electoral terms. If you came to discover that a defeat in a democratic election, let's bracket our most recent presidential election, and you'll understand why I say bracket it. But if you came to discover in the process of an election, you lost, your candidate didn't win. If you came to discover that that loss wasn't a passing loss, but a permanent one, it's not clear why you would ever go back to the polls to try it again. It's not at all clear you would think that this is a system worth participating in. So even when you lose in an election, you have to perceive the loss as not a permanent one. I can come back and try this again. And the fact that you perceive and you think that you can come back and try it again is your own way of saying, I can come back and perhaps my candidate can persuade my fellows to organize themselves differently. And that applies to your local candidate all the way up to the presidency. That's your own little aspiration. It's the thing that brings you back. And it is the thing that legitimizes the whole system. By legitimize, I mean make it worthy of respect and obedience. When African Americans were leaning on this aspirational language, they didn't create something that didn't exist before. This was precisely the same kind of logic that fueled the colonists. You need only go back to the Declaration of Independence. It was precisely because in the context of the Declaration that they came to discover that the king had the character of a tyrant that made the king unworthy of exercising power or leading a free people. The fact that they said that the king had the character of the tyrant meant in their mind that the king wouldn't be responsive to anything that they had to say. Tyrants usually are not. And if the king, understood now as a tyrant, won't be responsive to anything that you have to say, then the possibility of making your conditions otherwise are removed from the table. There are no reasons to have aspirations. And thus the colonists, their own criticism of the British crown, captured crudely in the representation line, is really an argument about what the king has removed from the table is the meaningfulness of our aspirations. And politics, the measure of it, is the skill with which it responds to our aspirations. And so it has seemed to me that whether we were talking about African Americans, whether we were talking about women, this distinction is central, both then and now, to how we understand the dynamism of our political system.
That's wonderful. Thank you. You mentioned the Declaration of Independence, and something that I wanted to lift up about, that I found just truly extraordinary about your book. I think you do something in here that I don't think I've ever seen a scholar do so deftly before, which is that you draw upon the ideas of two thinkers at various points who were themselves unquestionably steeped in white supremacy. You draw on Thomas Jefferson and you draw on Walt Whitman. And you do so without in any way excusing, justifying, or even significantly looking away from the reality of their racism. This is very noteworthy in your treatment of Jefferson, of whom you write that although he was, quote, himself animated by the logic of white supremacy, nonetheless you argue that the, quote, normative infrastructure of democracy he elucidates can be productively marshaled in the service of radically anti-racist democratic projects. And the way that you were able to draw upon these thinkers and put them to this use without thereby excusing the reality of their own white supremacy is the kind of move that I feel like is so important and instructive for students of the history of political thought. And so I would just love to hear you say something about how it is that you went about making such a move thinkable and why it felt important to your project to do so.
I don't know about all of you, but look, I got messy friends, right? I mean, we have people in our lives, family members who have some questionable characteristics, and then there are these other redeeming elements to them. And we don't just simply throw them out. We try to figure out how to lift up the redeeming elements. In the context of the grandness of politics, it seems to me that we have a messy tradition. And we can go through and begin to sort of exercise and remove figures if we like, but one result of that will be to distort the political and philosophical inheritance that shaped the thinkers that we in fact do love. There is no way to make sense of Walker, of Mariah Stewart, of Anna Julia Cooper, of Du Bois, independent of the ways in which they had grappled with Thomas Jefferson. And it seemed to me that Thomas Jefferson spent a good deal of time thinking about what does it mean to make the founders in my time irrelevant in the future time. And the reason why Jefferson spent a good deal of time thinking in that way is because if we're constantly looking to the past for answers about precisely how to proceed, then what will turn out to be the case, that it will be those past actors that are free, those past actors that are sovereign, and we are not. And so when Jefferson meditated on the meaning of the Constitution, he was quite clear that the Constitution that had been constructed in his day was a Constitution for his time, and that the Constitution needs to move with agility as it comes, in his words, to discover new truths about how human beings relate to each other. And were we not to do that, he insisted, it would be like asking a grown man to put on their coat that they once wore when they were a child. And he insisted that in order to make the society responsive, you have to free yourself, in his words, from your barbarous ancestors. And so it seemed to me that here it is, great. And it was put to use by African American thinkers in ways that Jefferson himself could never imagine, and in ways from which Jefferson recoiled. The same thing was done with Walt Whitman. When we read Democratic Vistas by Walt Whitman, one of the things that we come to realize very quickly is that Walt Whitman, yes, he thinks about democracy as about institutional arrangements. So yes, it is about that. But he also insists that democracy is also about a way of life. And it is about a way of organizing ourselves in relation to each other that's not merely about habits and sensibilities, but it literally, in his mind, is about bodily orientation, somatic indicators. You know, how do we stand in relation to each other in a line in the space, right? How do we shake hands, right? And this is in part because he thought that there's a kind of, in his mind, that there's a kind of intimacy to democratic life. And so Whitman often appealed to art as a means to help us craft these more expansive visions of ourselves. And he insisted that art was quite important. Well, Whitman failed in drawing on the right kind of art, right? Billie Holiday did. So when Billie Holiday sings Strange Fruit, which is about lynching, and when she performed it in Cafe Society in New York City, when she insisted that all of the lights be dimmed, no more service, and the spotlight was only on her, and when she sung the words of Strange Fruit and began to contort her mouth, she was trying to perform for her audience what lynching photographs and lynching events should elicit from them: horror. She tried to perform it on her body. Because in those grimaces, in the recoiling as she sung the song, she meant to communicate what the proper norms should be in confronting those kinds of events. The reason why the bodies hanging from trees are strange is because this is not sustenance at all. These are not nutrients. This, in fact, deforms the body. It deforms the body politic. And so Whitman had an insight. These black folks were sensitive to Whitman, and they would put it to usage that Whitman himself couldn't imagine. And as my colleague and dear friend Jack Turner would say, Billie Holiday would recoil from it. You're right, but that's okay, because I don't need all the Whitman, right?
Thank you. This is, again, extraordinary. I was going to follow up by asking you to say a few words about Billie Holiday and about the idea of democracy as a way of life, and you've absolutely beaten me to it, which means that it's a perfect time for us to turn to the audience and to open up for questions from the audience for Dr. Rogers, about his ideas, about what it means to lead a democratic way of life, what it means to have faith, or any other ideas that are elicited by reflections on this talk and his book.
Cocktail time.
I mean, I got more questions. I can keep asking nerdy political theory questions, but I'd love to.
We've got one here.
I'm still processing a little bit. I'm thinking, I just taught about polarization in my gender communication class today, social polarization. And then you talk about intimacy and democracy having a type of intimacy. So I don't have like a fully formed question there, but I'm wondering if that's something that's lacking in modern democracy, like an intimacy, and we have polarization, we have not connecting, we have not being in community. I don't know what you think about that, or if that makes sense.
No, it does make sense. I mean, I think we're in a worse condition than polarization. As I was saying, talking to students earlier today over pizza, polarization typically has in mind a kind of shared normative space around which there's disagreement. We're pulling in different directions. I'm not so sure anymore that we animate the same worldview, and on that kind of description, it's not even clear how intimacy gets off the ground at all. But that darker picture may be me taking the perspective of the loudest and most powerful folks that seem to want to drive a wedge, right, in our shared life. And so if one is willing to sort of speculate that, well, maybe there isn't a one-to-one correspondence between, I don't know, what Trump and Musk are doing and those that voted for them, if we want to be generous in this regard, then that creates the possibility for intimacy. It minimally suggests that we need to find ways to be in literally, discursively, closer proximity to understand what it is we're doing, right? Because in the distance, what we're doing is being misdescribed and is seemingly generating division and antagonism and the like.
I apologize if you addressed this already, but I was wondering, through your research and drafting, was there anything that was surprising that you uncovered and found applicable, or especially applicable to the current climate?
I mean, so as I was moving along in my research and advancing the argument, one of the things that kept emerging as I was presenting the research to folks was this tendency to treat the aspirational description of the people that I try to illuminate across the pages of the book, to treat that as, well, isn't that just another instantiation of American exceptionalism? Isn't that just simply another way of talking about the mythos of America's greatness? And it had boggled my mind. I didn't quite understand why people seem to want to hijack the language in this way. And when I sort of stepped back and said, well, okay, let me just sit for a moment with the exceptionalist rhetoric that has sort of defined American political thought, what you quickly come to discover is that that itself was sort of pitched in aspirational terms. So what I found myself needing to do was, okay, well, I need to figure out a way of how to help the reader distinguish between the aspirational politics of these Black folks and what I would come to call in the book a kind of deformed aspirational politics. Why is it deformed, right? Why is it appropriate for me to describe it in this way? One of the things that I came to realize is that there's a form of aspirational politics that emerges because thinkers and activists believe that we have fallen away from the righteous path of the Declaration of Independence. So when you get to Gunnar Myrdal's book, American Dilemma, part of what he argues is that, look, the American creed was pure and right at the founding. It is our application where we got things wrong. And so in his idiom, he aspired to return us back to what was originally entailed by the founders. But that then involved making some other judgments about, well, how do you make sense of race? Or how do you make sense of patriarchy? And his answer was, those are aberrations. Those are abnormalities in a society that is otherwise intending to be healthy in a specific kind of way. The difference between that kind of aspirational politics and the aspirational politics of Douglass is that Douglass doesn't see white supremacy as an aberration. He doesn't see it as an anomaly. He sees it as part and parcel of our tradition, requiring us to lean on other aspects of our tradition to contest it. And what that then led me to, and I'll conclude on this, what that led me to say, which unsettled some of my colleagues, political theorists, it led me to say that the problem of racial inequality is a scar on the American polity that won't go away. It is with us. That is just it. And if it's the kind of thing that won't go away, that makes Americans generally very nervous, because we believe there is no problem too great that we can't solve. And here I was at the conclusion of the book that had been arguing for aspirational politics, saying ultimately, these figures are like, no, it won't go away. But what emerges out of that is a different kind of opportunity. Some of us maybe in this room have known betrayal, have known disappointment, and have found a way to get on with those people, and get on with those people in very meaningful ways. You might even have forgiven them. You don't forget. But that means then, how are you able to get on? You begin to measure the quality of the relationship by the agility with which each of you display a kind of sensitivity to a betrayal that once happened. And in fact, all of the good that comes out of that relationship can't even make sense independent of the betrayal that frames it. And we begin to measure the worth of each other by that agility, by the skills that emerge, right? And the same is possible for a nation, even as we accept that the problem of white supremacy and racial inequality is not going away. But we may see our fellows struggling to hold it at bay, and that should count for something.
Thank you, Dr. Rogers. How do you think that we can continue to interact with our democratic institutions that can build a stronger faith in it? Because I think some people are struggling to feel that faith.
Well, I think we should always engage with our institutions suspiciously, right? Including our democratic ones. And, we're at a wonderful university. I have met, since being here, extraordinary colleagues whose work I'm familiar with, whose work I've read, and I've met amazing students. You get some bad leaders in, you have faculty and students and trustees defer to them, and it all can come undone. And that means that the institutions, organizing them correctly matters a great deal, but ultimately, they are only as good or bad as the leaders that move through them. And the same thing applies to democratic institutions. I don't want to, politicize the moment too intensely. But just sort of think about our current institutions and where we are politically. Our system runs on a trust that people will do their jobs in light of their charge. And what happens in the chain of responsibility, where people just decide, no, I'm just going to do something else? Imagine if we were in a class together, I'm your professor, I read your paper, and I just treat you unfairly. You then go to my chair, and my chair says, no, I trust Melvin's judgment. It's like, well, this is unacceptable. You then go to the dean, the provost, whoever would be next in line. Same thing. You go to the president, same thing. Everyone has decided they're not going to act in accord with the values that inform the position that they inhabit. And that is not an issue of institutions. That is fundamentally an issue of character. Who do we take ourselves to be? And so what I would say is that this moment in which we find our democratic institutions in crisis, this is a wake-up call for us to realize that those institutions were always dependent on us. And along the way, we were just getting lucky. Right?
Hi, thank you so much. This has just been so amazing. But one thing that really stood out to me in your conversation about an aspirational political thinker and faith is when you're reading the news, when you're seeing everything that come out, how do you look at that and go, yeah, I'm still feeling inspired. Yeah, I still want to move forward. How do you keep holding that mindset throughout constant news source or news coming out?
So before I came over here, I've gotten into the habit for talks related to this book of rewatching an interview that Toni Morrison did with Farrah Griffin. Farrah Griffin is at Columbia University. And Toni Morrison is reflecting on her own lament and disappointment around an election. And I'm sure some of you have seen this video where she can't write. And I think it's one of her editors calls her, what's going on? She's like, I can't write, I can't get going. And then she begins to talk about the political mess. And her editor's like, no. This is the time when writers get to work. And it seems to me, I always watch it because it just seems to me that, our country has known very dark days. You all are here studying. You can point to moments in the history of those dark days for people. And this is the time when we get to work. And one of the things that our political circumstances, if the current arrangement is going to continue to win the day, one of the things that it is relying on is that we sort of lose faith in each other. And I know it sounds silly and romantic, but it is quite true, because there is no way to bear the weight of what we're enduring independent of each other. All right? Our universities in the next couple of weeks and months are going to face some critical questions. Are they going to try to go it alone? Or are they going to gather together and resist? And so I say, it's difficult. And we need to take time to gather ourselves, but faith has always lived in other people. It's never just simply been an idea. It's always lived in other people, right? Our commitments and the meaning of freedom and equality, it always lives in other people. It's nice to have the backing of law. We ultimately want the backing of law, but we want to see in the eyes of our fellows a kind of affirmation of who we are as much as we are affirming who they are, right? So I say, take some time, gather yourself, pull your friends, family close, professors close, and say, okay, what's the next step?
Thank you. I'm curious what you think a person who's positioned from a society that has legitimized an aspirational politic and aspirational democracy, what they would say to us from our position tonight here in this room together.
I think I missed it. Say that first part again.
Yeah,
Sorry.
a person who is positioned from a society that has legitimized an aspirational politic, that has legitimized already and is acting upon actively an aspirational democracy.
I mean, Germany seems to be trying to tell us some things these days. Although Germany has its own, it has its own issues vis-a-vis Israel, Palestinians. I mean, to that question, I don't really know. I mean, we have political actors on the national scene who are somewhat thrown off by all of what is happening in the United States and happening so quickly. And I think the international community is thrown off in part because one shared understanding about politics, even when there's a transfer of power through democratic means, one shared understanding seems to be, you go in and you enact your agenda, but you don't shock the system. And the way in which the current administration is moving very quickly to shock the system, and the result of which is that it's not giving a great many people time to sort of figure out how to respond, right? I think the one thing that has emerged among the folks out of Germany and Canada and England is their sense that what seems to tie all of the activities of the American president, what ties all of those activities together is a commitment to cruelty. And as Judith Scalar would put it, Richard Rorty would put it, cruelty is the worst thing that a liberal democracy can do.
What do you think they would ask of us in our own daily actions on how we can change our habits and sensibilities?
I'm not quite sure. I think the question is what we would ask of ourselves, and I think our tradition tells us we have to organize. We have to resist. And nothing short, in my mind, nothing short, here I'm channeling Du Bois, nothing short of a grand general strike. Nothing short of that, it seems to me, that's what's required in this moment. But of course, that we got to make some hard choices. Are we willing to put some things on the line? Right? I ask myself that. Here I am saying a general strike. Do I want to put it on the line? Right?
Hi. Oh, is it me next? Hi. I guess my question is about why faith in democracy? Like, why is that the aspiration? Why are we leaning into democracy? I just wonder where. It seems like our faith could be, if we're really aspirational, it could be a multitude of places, multiple. I mean, the yet unknown. Why democracy? Even in this historical moment,
Yeah.
why still faith in democracy?
One of the things in my mind that I always distinguish between is institutions that are identified as being democratic and democracy as a way of life. And democracy as a way of life, the central principle that animates it is openness. So even if there is a future configuration of institutions that don't look anything like the ones that we have that are currently called democratic, if there's a future in which there's going to be some other configuration, it seems to me that the animating value that structures democracy makes or creates the conditions for us to engage in that kind of thinking. So that's why, for me, as I read these thinkers and their constant push on the principle of openness that underwrites the aspirational people, it had seemed to me that their relationship to democracy is not some relationship to a fixed institutional economic arrangement that is claimed to be democratic. That's what it seems to be now, right? But they don't preclude the possibility that some other configuration would do better justice to our commitment to freedom and equality.
Okay, thank you. So I had a question, I think, about the role of imagination, which I saw in your book, and I think you sort of talk about when you're talking about faith, and I think could maybe, I think you talking about that would help some of the student questions thinking about, like, what do we do now? What do we do now? And part of it is like the freedom to imagine what we want and how hard that is when we feel challenged by institutions that might not recognize us, or we feel threatened, or we feel shocked, and how maybe you saw that in different authors like Du Bois or someone, how they used imagination to imagine a world where they could be seen as equals or recognized or something like that. So, and I don't have imagination of a philosopher, so you got to help me out.
For these thinkers, the imagination is not denotative of the imaginary. That is to say, that the imagination pulls from the bits and pieces of a world not yet that exists here and that is fractured and fragmented. And that what Du Bois is doing, what Ida B. Wells is doing, is gathering up those pieces, mending them together into a coherent pattern of life, and projecting them forward as a way to discipline our actions in the present. That's how they're using the imagination. And it seems to me that in our current political moment, it's not like we don't have resources. It's not like we don't have traditions, right? It's not like there's not a constellation of values on which we can rely. It's not like there are not figures in this tradition that we could turn to. These are the fragments. And we have to decide whether or not we're interested in piecing it together and projecting it forward into a coherent pattern of life and willing to fight in the service of it. Or are we just going to sit back so devastated by the new arrangements that we find ourselves in? Well, if we're going to do that, then we need to ask some serious and hard questions about why we're so devastated. Right? We need to think about the ways in which we are sometimes animated, even from the radical left, by some quest for certainty about how our political arrangements are going to work and how they are going to unfold. Democracy is about institutions, it is about a way of life, it is about the imagination, but at bottom it is about power. Power that functions through fragile, corrupt, broken, and beautiful human beings. And we have to deal with all of that, right? So, as I said, look, we'd be devastated for, you read Frederick Douglass, you read Ida B. Wells, there's no way that you can remain devastated. Like, that's what they went through under far darker circumstances than our own. Okay, I gotta figure out what I'm gonna do. I think right now we're still dealing with shock, and we're gonna go through that for a while, and then we gotta figure out what we're gonna do.
Hi, thank you. All right, this might be a little bit of a ramble, but I was thinking about what Dr. Tolis was saying about like intimacy versus polarization in our current climate, and I was thinking about in one of my comm classes we learned about DeLuca and the idea of the public sphere versus the public screen. So this move, from like discussion being so communal and open and over cups of coffee and in all these public spaces to seeing the world and learning through screens. So whether that's like news, media, different perceptions, and I think like especially my generation, like media is our screen. So much of our democratic participation happens like online and on social media and digitally. And I think a lot of this idea of like democratic faith and having an aspirational orientation and all of that is done so much better in a public sphere, in a communal intimacy. So now, like, how do we best harness that? Like, how do we achieve that now in this like very different world?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a critical question. It's a very hard one because part of what we're dealing with is a fragmented informational life world in which it is terribly difficult to consolidate impressions around commitments. One of the things that I recently wrote about was a kind of open letter to Kamala Harris, insisting that she cannot proceed in the way that we normally proceed in democratic politics. You lose, you retreat into the shadows. And the argument of that piece is that given the gravity of the issue as she described it, her Democratic convention speech, very few moments in a nation's life where it has to decide what it will be, and that this is the moment. Her insistence on current President Trump, then candidate, being an existential threat. It seems to me that if there's anyone who can potentially cut through the existing noise, it is the one who came in second. And I know, it's like, well, wait a second, she told us you want her to come back out yet again and endure. Oh boy, you gotta get a black woman to save us. Yes. Because minimally, she can capture the public imagination by violating a ritual of democratic politics. The ritual is you retreat. But given the gravity of the issue, we don't want to damage it by claiming, because now you're gonna go into and retreat, that by claiming that it wasn't under the threat that you claimed that it was. And so it seems to me I'm not the kind of democratic theorist that believe in leaderless movements. So I am all for her returning to help cut through, and in cutting through, creating a wider forum for a whole series of other voices to come on the stage. I have listened and paid attention to AOC, who I think is absolutely extraordinary, but she's not able to command the stage in that way. Bernie Sanders, one would think, Elizabeth, just simply not. We got to get the person who's second to come back, I'm sorry. The person who is second coming back can't do it by herself, despite having won more than 74 plus million votes, right? She can't do it, right? She can't do it by herself. She would also need us to be ready to stand around her. And the point wouldn't be to engage, to sort of replicate from the left January 6th. No, the point would be to serve as the loudest scorekeeper. I didn't win the election, she would say. He won, but he made promises. And I told you what he will do. And I told you what he will do based on an actual book that exists, Project 2025. So I'm gonna keep score for you. And I'm gonna show you how everything seems to map to what I warned you about. And I think at least at this moment, that could be one moment to cut through the fragmentation. We still have to deal with the downstream effect, which the analysis that you're laying out still points to, that we are a fragmented society attempting to manage a vision of political organization that in its conceptual development depends on intimacy. This again, I think, is the role of the imagination. How do we, I think about, this is crude, but because it comes from an example from my home. I think about my son who's 8. We permit him to play video games, and he is usually playing with friends and talking to them. And I know this, when I was growing up, you go outside, you play, you're with people, right? And I was constantly lamenting to my partner, like, we gotta get him outside, you know. But when we get him outside, it's all organized. You do a play date over here, you go to gymnastics over here, but it's never the spontaneous thing that we used to do. You kind of go out, for some of us here, that you go out and you just bump into people and have fun. But then I noticed something. It's very weird. I was in my office, he was in his room playing the game, and suddenly I heard singing. His friends online were singing a song. They all were singing it together. And he had the controller and they were playing, but they were singing this song. There are sometimes he's in the room with the controller like this, not even playing. Yeah, we just had dinner and blah, and they're having full-on like they met in person. And it got me thinking, we find ways to create intimacy. What we have to figure out is how to think about this in a more deliberate, structured way that can help serve as an antidote to the fragmentation of our life worlds.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to speak with us tonight. I think that maybe one of the biggest ways that we show our democratic faith is probably through voting. It's our maybe most formal way of saying, yes, we believe in democracy, let's keep it up. But I think that, like a lot of people have mentioned already, we're living in a very politically polarized environment, and we see that our two main political parties, they don't like to work with each other that much. And it's kind of, I think, hard to have that faith, right? That's kind of been the overall theme of most of the questions. But yet we keep voting, right? And we have faith in one of the political parties' rhetorics, and we hope that that person or candidate or party, whatever, wins. And, we move on from there. But I think when we have faith in voting, it's kind of this two-way street, right? We have the faith ourselves in democracy and the ideals that we see from the Declaration of Independence, but we also have to get that faith from what the political parties are telling us, I think. And I think that right now, voters are kind of losing faith in the rhetoric of the political parties maybe these days. So my question for you is, how do you think the political parties, or our two main ones, can go about kind of reinstilling some more faith in our voters going forward in future elections?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've been struck, I'm only going to use, formally I'm not, an Americanist. Like, I don't study American politics, properly speaking, in the way the Americanists do. But the one thing I've been struck by is AOC's insistence on trying to be ultra transparent. She'll get on social media and she'll be on there for like 2 hours, 3 hours, just chatting with people and trying to work through with them what she's thinking. Or Pete Buttigieg, when it was during the election, and of course he was serving as a surrogate for Kamala Harris, and he was doing these rapid fire conversations. Did you all see these rapid fire? So he would get with a big group, mostly dominated by Republicans. He would be sitting there, and anyone could step up, and maybe you get 2 minutes, and just go back and forth. And he was answering every single question. And what was so interesting is that in the context of watching it, you could tell those individuals that no matter how good he was in responding, they weren't voting for Kamala Harris. But you could also tell those people who were quite surprised by what he revealed in his response to the issue around tariffs, or to the issue around the future of abortion under one administration rather than another. I think the AOC kind of modeled, the Pete Buttigieg kind of modeled, the attempt to be ultra transparent could potentially be one important step toward generating confidence in the American people. I think the more basic one is that, look, whether we're talking about the Republicans or whether we're talking about the Democrats during the recent presidential election, there's always this talk of the middle class. But the language of poor people, it just doesn't seem to get on the table, right? Even Bernie Sanders, prior to the defeat, was using the language of middle class. There is a sizable amount of poor folks in this country who are sort of living on the edge, who just think it doesn't work, there's no need, that we are not speaking to. And the vast majority of those folks don't look like me. They're white folks. And it does seem to me that if the Democrats are going to take this seriously, then they too need to sort of investigate their own relationship to and their own embrace of oligarchic sensibilities, right? And that may also be one step to try and to improve how Americans see their political leaders. Right? This is all speculative, though. Yeah.
I think we can squeeze in one last question.
Hi, I was just thinking in regards to an answer that you gave before about Kamala Harris stepping out of the shadows and taking sort of a more active role during the current administration. And I'm just wondering what you think the outcome of that would be. Like, are we looking to the next election? Are we looking to something more immediate? I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, my sense is that everything that she said that would happen is currently happening. And so, let's step out and point it all out. And that's why I said she could be the loudest voice doing that. Now, look, she's a politician. She may still have aspirations for the presidency. She shouldn't be dishonest about that. You can say, yeah, I'm back out here because I got my eye on the presidency. But I got my eye on the presidency because what I told you would happen is happening. And she could be honest about that. I think the worst thing to do is to proceed as if you're out here just engaged in a kind of political audit, but you're not interested in holding national office, whether it's the presidency or the governorship of California. You don't want to do that, right? So that's the way I'm thinking about this, and it seems to me that one immediate result might be is to focus the Democratic Party and to awaken the American citizenry to what precisely is going on. And the reason why I say that is because let's think about it. We vote, we feel like, okay, we did what we're supposed to do, now I need to get back to my life. Because, remember I said at the beginning, you got a job to do. So you go do your job, and I'm gonna get back to living and enjoying. And the reason why I put it that way is because the relationships we have, the connections that we form in these institutions that we're moving through, the moments of retreat that we can engage in, all of that is what makes life enjoyable. But government is what makes it livable. And we need someone to awaken us to the fact that there are a great many of Americans whose lives are being made very, very difficult and very quickly, and illegitimately so. Whether we're talking about federal workers who are without employment, whether we're talking about teachers with the resources for helping children on the spectrum, those resources are tied up, whether we're talking about kids who are worried about whether or not when they get home from school, mom or dad are gonna be there or not because ICE is out. What binds all of these very disparate acts together, these very disparate conditions together, is the cruelty that informs the policy that is responsible for that federal worker that is out of work, for that child who's worried about whether or not mom or dad will be home, or that teacher that's worried about whether or not they're going to have the resources to help their students. Cruelty is the thing that is behind it. And we need someone to sort of gather it all up and speak consistently. And once again, it just seems to me the one who came in second.
On that note, I want to ask you all to join me in thanking Dr. Timothy McCarty and Dr. Melvin Rogers for this wonderful discussion.